Pittsburgh, before the bombs, stood as one of America's crowning industrial metropolises, a city whose very identity was forged in steel and fire. Its skyline dominated by the hum of factories, the endless rhythm of conveyor belts, and the ceaseless smoke that rose from the heart of its steel mills. The city had grown from its 18th century foundations on the confluence of the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers into a nexus of iron and industry, drawing workers from across the nation and the world, each seeking opportunity in the furnaces and foundries that defined the city. And in its pre-war decades, Pittsburgh's economy had not merely sustained the region, but had helped propel the United States into its status as a global industrial leader, producing vast quantities of steel that built bridges, vehicles, railways, and armaments, and its citizens had lived lives intimately tied to the pulse of machinery, the clang of hammers, and the ceaseless demand of production that gave the city both wealth and purpose. Yet, as was true for all American cities in the late 21st century, Pittsburgh was not insulated from the creeping shadows of political tension, overpopulation, and the escalating energy crisis, all of which foreshadowed the coming apocalypse. And when the Great War finally arrived in October of 2077, the city was among countless urban centers reduced to rubble, though it was spared the immediate catastrophic blast of the nuclear strikes that annihilated Washington, D.C., and other strategic targets. Pittsburgh instead endured the slow, relentless collapse that came from firestorms, infrastructure failure, and the spread of radiation through its water systems and air, leaving the steel skeletons of factories standing like tombstones over a devastated landscape. In the immediate aftermath, the city became a labyrinth of ruins, where bridges that had once symbolized connection now spanned chasms of death and decay, and the rivers themselves carried the detritus of human civilization, toxic sludge from the mills mingling with debris from shattered buildings, while pockets of survivors clung to life in makeshift shelters, scavenging what remained of the pre-war world, foraging for food, water, and tools amid the wreckage. It was in this crucible of devastation that Pittsburgh's post-war identity began to coalesce, not as a city of commerce and innovation, but as a domain of survival and dominion, a place where those strong enough to wield control over resources and labor could impose their will over the desperate masses. And it was here that Ishmael Ashur would eventually emerge as a figure of authority, transforming Pittsburgh into the city known in the wasteland simply as the Pitt, a place defined by its iron and smoke, its slavery and industry, and the brutal hierarchy that sustained its functioning. In the years following the war, the survivors of Pittsburgh faced not only the lingering radiation and structural collapse, but also the outbreak of the Troglodyte Plague, a disease whose origin can be traced to the convergence of pre-existing genetic disorders, environmental contamination, and the immunological stress imposed on populations confined to dense, unsanitary conditions within the ruins, which left many afflicted with grotesque mutations, weakened bodies, and shortened lifespans, exacerbating the already dire circumstances of a population struggling to rebuild amidst ruins. The city's geography, once advantageous for industry and trade, now became a double-edged sword. The rivers could provide water, but were contaminated. The bridges facilitated movement, but also channeled raider incursions, and the dense urban landscape offered both shelter and hazards, forcing the remaining citizens into constant adaptation. In the vacuum of pre-war governmental authority and law enforcement, power in Pittsburgh was claimed not by democratic institutions or social contracts, but through control of the steel mills and the means of production. the remnants of industrial infrastructure, transforming into tools of coercion. And it was in this environment that Ashur, having been exiled from the Brotherhood of Steel, seized opportunity, employing both cunning and force to assert dominion over the laboring population, establishing a rigid social order in which the enslaved worked the furnaces and mined the remnants of steel and raw materials, their labor essential to the city's survival, yet exploited to the maximum for the enrichment and empowerment of their overlords. A hierarchy maintained through intimidation, fear, and the ever-present threat of death. The transformation of Pittsburgh into the Pit was not instantaneous, but a gradual process shaped by the harsh necessities of post-nuclear life. Survival required organization, and organization required control, and those who could impose it with sufficient ruthlessness became the de facto rulers, reshaping the city into a unique microcosm of post-apocalyptic society, a place where industry continued not for commerce or trade, but for the maintenance of authority and the extraction of wealth from the oppressed. Thus, by the time outsiders such as the lone wanderer would eventually arrive, the Pit was already a fully realized dystopia, its skyline still dominated by the skeletal remains of pre-war factories, its streets patrolled by enforcers loyal to Ashur, its population divided between those who labored in the mills, those who administered the machinery of control, and those who simply tried to survive within the interstices of this harsh, steel and smoke-bound world. The history of Pittsburgh's rise and fall, from its industrial apex to its post-war transformation into the Pit, exemplifies the broader trajectory of American civilization in the Fallout universe, illustrating both the heights of human ingenuity and industry and the depths of societal collapse and moral compromise when nuclear catastrophe reshapes the landscape and humanity itself, leaving behind a city whose identity, though altered beyond recognition, remains tethered to its industrial roots, and whose legacy is a cautionary testament to the fragility of civilization and the enduring imprint of human ambition, resilience, and cruelty. The events that led to the destruction of Pittsburgh, and indeed much of the United States, were not the result of a single catastrophe, but a cascade of escalating tensions and technological failures, culminating in the nuclear exchanges of the 23rd of October 2077, a day that would forever redefine the landscape of the continent and the very trajectory of human civilization. And Pittsburgh, located within the inland northeastern industrial corridor, endured the war's indirect consequences, experiencing massive firestorms that swept through its urban core, consuming wooden structures, igniting chemical stores, and collapsing the skeletal framework of pre-war infrastructure, while leaving steel buildings partially standing, but scarred and unstable, a grim testament to both the city's industrial resilience and its vulnerability. And in the immediate aftermath of the bombings, survivors faced not only the visible destruction, but also the insidious and lethal spread of radiation, which permeated air, water, and soil, poisoning the environment and altering the genetic integrity of living organisms within its reach. And as the weeks and months unfolded, the confluence of poor sanitation, dense population pockets, and exposure to irradiated materials created fertile ground for the emergence of diseases, the most notorious of which in the Pittsburgh region became the Troglodyte Plague, a disease that would leave an indelible mark on the human and non-human populations alike, manifesting in grotesque physical mutations, stunted growth, neurological degradation, and in severe cases, death and though the precise origins of the plague remain partially obscured by the fog of post-war chaos, its development can be traced to the combination of pre-existing industrial pollutants, radiation-induced genetic instability, and the compromised immune systems of survivors who were malnourished, stressed, and forced into close living quarters in ruined shelters and repurposed factory buildings, while the disease spread silently through contaminated water supplies, airborne particles, and direct contact, leaving those who survived the initial bombings susceptible to a second wave of destruction that was as much biological as it was structural. And in this environment, the concept of organized governance or medical intervention was all but non-existent, as local leadership collapsed under the strain of resource scarcity and the sheer unpredictability of the post-apocalyptic environment, giving rise to self-organized groups and factions that prioritized immediate survival over long-term planning or ethical considerations, and the plague itself acted as both a literal and symbolic agent of transformation, converting the already traumatized population into a cityscape of the afflicted, where disease and fear intertwined with human desperation, and survivors were forced to adapt to conditions that mutated both the human body and social structures, as makeshift quarantine zones, scavenger patrols, and primitive medical efforts arose alongside the grim normalization of suffering, and over time, certain individuals, most notably Ishmael Ashur, recognized that control of labor, access to medicine, and the manipulation of fear could be leveraged to consolidate power, using the pervasive threat of illness as a means of coercion and to enforce a strict hierarchy in which those who worked the steel mills were both essential and expendable, and the disease, while physically debilitating, also served as a tool to maintain order within the emerging power structures of the Pitt, shaping its social dynamics and creating a clear division between the ruling elite and the enslaved workforce. And within this crucible, the environmental devastation wrought by the firestorms further compounded the challenges faced by survivors, as radiation-scarred rivers, crumbling bridges, and unstable factory structures posed constant hazards, limiting mobility and making trade or escape extraordinarily difficult, forcing the population into tight enclaves where the plague could propagate unchecked, yet simultaneously fostering a grim ingenuity among those who sought to survive, who scavenged irradiated scrap to repair tools, diverted polluted water into crude filtration systems, and cultivated any patches of soil that were marginally less toxic, all of which contributed to the persistence of human habitation in an environment that would have been otherwise unlivable. And as the seasons passed, natural processes interacted with man-made devastation in unpredictable ways, with invasive flora taking root in rubble-strewn streets, mutagenic fauna preying upon the weak, and persistent fogs of radioactive dust shaping visibility and human movement, and the combination of environmental hazards and the biological scourge of the plague created a landscape where life itself was measured in cycles of risk and adaptation, reinforcing the brutal social order that Ashur and other emerging leaders imposed, as obedience, productivity, and utility to the collective became the metrics of survival, and those unable to conform were often removed from the workforce, either through enforced exile into the wastelands of the city's ruins, or through death, which served as both punishment and a cautionary exemplar, reinforcing the stark realities of post-war Pittsburgh. Furthermore, the spread of the plague was not uniform, as some sectors of the city remained relatively isolated and less affected, giving rise to pockets of comparatively healthier survivors whose limited mobility allowed for the retention of pre-war knowledge and skills, though these enclaves were rare and constantly under threat from both disease and the encroachment of those seeking shelter or resources. And over time, patterns of infection, survival, and adaptation became intertwined with social and economic hierarchies, making the disease an intrinsic part of the city's political landscape as access to clean water, food, and medical care became concentrated in the hands of those able to assert authority. And this interdependence between power and survival laid the foundation for the rigid, industrialized society that would eventually emerge as the Pitt, where life was measured by productivity and resilience in the face of environmental and biological adversity, and the narrative of the firestorm and plague also exemplifies the broader consequences of nuclear war in the Fallout universe, illustrating how technological annihilation interacts with ecological systems, human biology, and social structures to produce emergent forms of civilization that are both alien and recognizable. And as historians of the wasteland would later note, Pittsburgh's descent from a proud industrial city into a plague-ridden dystopia was neither instantaneous nor inevitable, but the result of a convergence of historical, environmental, and human factors where the firestorm reduced infrastructure, the plague decimated populations, and the vacuum of authority allowed the rise of tyrants who could manipulate fear and scarcity to maintain control, thus transforming the city into a living testament to the fragility of civilization, the enduring power of human ingenuity and cruelty, and the capacity for adaptation in the face of catastrophic change. And by the time the first outsiders, such as Werner and the Lone Wanderer, arrived, the city had already been shaped by these forces into a grim microcosm of post-apocalyptic society, a place where industry, disease, and tyranny coexisted in a delicate yet precarious balance. And the legacy of the firestorm and the plague persisted not only in the bodies and structures of the Pit, but also in the cultural memory and historical record of the capital wasteland and beyond, serving as a warning and a lesson about the costs of nuclear conflict and the resilience and moral compromises of humanity under conditions of extreme duress. In the aftermath of the nuclear devastation that consumed much of the eastern United States, Pittsburgh survivors emerged into a cityscape, transformed beyond recognition, a chaotic labyrinth of twisted steel, shattered masonry, and the lingering haze of radioactive fallout, where the remnants of pre-war society were scattered among crumbling factories and empty streets, and those who had endured the initial firestorms and the insidious spread of the Troglodyte Plague faced an unrelenting struggle to adapt, to survive, and to carve meaning out of a world stripped of its familiar structures. And it was within this environment that the first survivor enclaves began to coalesce, not as formal governments, but as ad hoc communities bound by necessity, mutual protection, and the shared understanding that isolation or indecision would lead quickly to death. And these groups, composed of those who had been lucky, skilled, or ruthless enough to endure the immediate horrors of nuclear fire and disease, occupied the remnants of the city's industrial infrastructure, repurposing half-collapsed factories as shelters, scavenging machinery for tools, and gathering scrap metal, wood, and salvaged materials to reinforce weak structures against the elements, radiation, and the ever-present threat of hostile raiders or desperate scavengers. And their survival strategies were diverse, reflecting both the ingenuity and the desperation of post-war humanity, including the collection and rationing of uncontaminated water, the cultivation of small, fortified gardens wherever patches of arable soil could be found, and the careful management of fuel, food, and medical supplies, which were now more precious than gold. And while some survivors attempted to maintain fragments of pre-war societal norms, such as barter, rudimentary law, or collective decision-making, the overwhelming pressures of the environment often rendered these efforts fragile, and in many cases, those with greater physical strength, tactical skill, or access to weapons rapidly assumed positions of informal authority, enforcing compliance and protection through force rather than consensus, establishing early forms of hierarchy and social control that would later be solidified by figures like Ishmael Ashur, who recognized the power inherent in controlling both labor and survival resources. And as these early communities adapted, they developed a culture of pragmatism and caution, where every decision, from when to venture outside the shelter to whom to trust with a ration of water, was weighed against the constant threat of disease, starvation, or violence. And these conditions produced both remarkable resilience and extraordinary cruelty, as survivors learned that mercy could invite death, and hesitation could be fatal, and the moral calculus of life in Pittsburgh's ruins was stark, forcing individuals to choose between self-preservation, loyalty to others, and the potential for longer-term collective benefit, a tension that would underpin the city's eventual social structure, including the strict labor hierarchies imposed by Ashur upon the enslaved workforce, where every task completed in the furnaces, mines, or workshops was a testament to the survivor's utility and endurance, and failure to contribute or comply was punished swiftly, reflecting a broader post-apocalyptic ethos that equated value with productivity, a principle that had its roots in the earliest survivor enclaves, when individuals and small groups had to prove themselves useful to the collective or face exile or death, and the physical environment itself dictated much of the social organization, as flooded tunnels, unstable bridges, and irradiated zones forced survivors into pockets of relative safety, creating natural boundaries that both protected communities and limited their interactions with neighboring enclaves, thereby fostering local identities, rivalries, and alliances that mirrored the fragmented political landscape of the broader wasteland. And in these enclaves, survivors also contended with the unpredictable presence of mutated wildlife, such as feral dogs, rats, and irradiated insects, which posed constant threats to unprotected humans, while the persistent danger of structural collapse, contaminated water, and lingering pockets of radiation demanded vigilance and ingenuity, reinforcing a culture in which caution, adaptability, and resourcefulness were essential for survival. And these conditions forged a society that, while primitive compared to pre-war standards, was highly functional in its own right, capable of sustaining human life under circumstances that would have been fatal to unprepared individuals. And it was within this framework of necessity and adaptation that early forms of leadership and organization emerged, where individuals who could coordinate scavenging parties, repair equipment, or mediate disputes gained influence, laying the foundation for the more formalized and oppressive social hierarchy that would later be codified under Ashur's rule, as the ability to manage labor, maintain production, and enforce compliance became central to controlling the remnants of the population, and the survivors' interactions with one another were also shaped by the lingering psychological trauma of the Great War, the firestorms, and the plague, which manifested in distrust, suspicion, and at times violent reactivity, but also in moments of cooperation, compassion, and ingenuity that allowed human culture, even in a distorted form, to persist amidst devastation. And in studying the archaeological and historical record of Pittsburgh during this period, it is clear that the patterns established by these early survivor communities, pragmatic cooperation, hierarchical enforcement, adaptation to environmental hazards, and integration of labor into survival strategies, directly influenced the emergence of the Pitt as a functioning, if brutal, post-war city, demonstrating that even in the absence of centralized government or formal institutions, human beings possess a remarkable capacity to organize, endure, and exert control over both environment and fellow humans, and the lived experience of these survivors, navigating the ruins with limited resources, constant threat, and evolving social structures, provides critical insight into how post-apocalyptic societies develop organically from the remnants of pre-war civilization, setting the stage for the rise of Ashur, the consolidation of labor hierarchies, and the transformation of Pittsburgh from a shattered industrial city into the oppressive, iron and smoke-bound dystopia that would become known as the Pitt, a city where survival was inseparable from productivity, adaptation, and the ever-present negotiation between fear and resilience, and where the lessons of early survival among the ruins would echo in the social and industrial structures that defined its future, exemplifying the broader dynamics of post-nuclear human civilization across the capital wasteland, and highlighting both the fragility and the enduring resourcefulness of humankind in the face of absolute catastrophe. The figure of Ishmael Ashur, whose name would come to define the harsh social and industrial realities of the Pitt, did not emerge spontaneously from the ashes of post-war Pittsburgh, but was instead the product of decades of pre-war experience, wartime upheaval, and post-war adaptation, beginning with his early affiliation with the Brotherhood of Steel, an organization whose strict adherence to technological preservation, martial discipline, and hierarchical authority shaped Ashur's worldview and instilled in him both the skills and the ideological framework that would later enable him to dominate a devastated city. And while the precise details of his early service within the Brotherhood remain partially obscured, it is clear that he distinguished himself through technical expertise, combat capability, and a capacity for strategic thinking, qualities that earned him positions of authority but also fostered resentment among peers who viewed his ambition and ruthlessness with suspicion, and these tensions ultimately culminated in Ashur's exile from the Brotherhood, a consequence of both political infighting and the ideological divergence that arose when his vision for leadership conflicted with the organization's collective decision-making processes, leaving him cast into the harsh realities of the post-war wasteland, a region rife with danger, scarcity, and the fragmented remnants of human civilization, where survival depended not only on strength and skill, but also on the ability to impose one's will upon others. And it was in this environment that Ashur's transformation from an exiled soldier and technologist into the authoritarian figure known as the ruler of the Pitt began, a process marked by both cunning strategy and brutal pragmatism, as he quickly recognized that control over labor, resources, and information would be the currency of power in a society shaped by destruction and fear, and leveraging his knowledge of pre-war technology and industrial systems, he established himself in Pittsburgh, a city devastated by firestorms, structural collapse, and the spread of the Troglodyte Plague, where scattered survivors struggled to maintain rudimentary subsistence, and where authority was contested among the strongest and most ruthless individuals. and Ashur, understanding the potential of the city's remaining industrial infrastructure, repurposed the steel mills, workshops, and salvageable machinery to create both economic leverage and the means to enforce social hierarchy, organizing the population into a strictly divided society in which enslaved laborers performed the essential work of production, while a cadre of enforcers and administrators maintained order and punished dissent, a system that simultaneously ensured the city's functionality and reinforced Ashur's personal dominion. And the methods he employed were both practical and psychological, combining material incentives, coercion, and symbolic displays of power to instill obedience, demonstrating a keen awareness of human behavior and the mechanisms by which authority could be maintained in a context of scarcity, fear, and disease. And the consolidation of his rule was aided by the city's geography and pre-existing infrastructure, as Pittsburgh's rivers, bridges, and factories created natural boundaries that limited movement and concentrated the population, allowing Ashur to monitor, regulate, and manipulate both labor and survival, while the pervasive threat of the Troglodyte Plague and the harsh environmental conditions reinforced the necessity of centralized control, as those who resisted or failed to meet expectations risked death or exile into irradiated zones, a constant reminder of the consequences of defiance. And Ashur's rise was further enabled by the psychological conditioning of the population, who had endured years of fire, disease, and uncertainty, and who were compelled to view productivity and obedience as inseparable from survival. A dynamic that Ashur exploited through both ritualized labor practices, such as the organization of work brigades, and the calculated use of fear, punishment, and public demonstrations of authority, creating a social structure in which loyalty was enforced, dissent was punished, and the very act of survival was contingent upon submission to the established hierarchy. And his governance was characterized not by arbitrary cruelty alone, but by the rigorous application of rules and expectations designed to maintain industrial output, preserve order, and prevent chaos from reclaiming the devastated urban landscape, reflecting his continued belief in the principles of efficiency, order, and the utility of human labor that had been instilled during his time with the Brotherhood, yet adapted to the extreme conditions of post-war Pittsburgh, where conventional morality had little bearing on the imperatives of survival and reconstruction. And this system extended beyond the management of labor to include the control of information, resources, and mobility within the city, with Ashur regulating access to water, food, and medical care, and positioning himself as the arbiter of life and death, a role both feared and accepted by the population as necessary for the functioning of the pit. And through a combination of strategic alliances, intimidation, and the monopolization of essential resources, Ashur cemented his authority, gradually transforming the pit from a fragmented collection of survivor enclaves into a highly structured, albeit oppressive, post-apocalyptic society, where industry continued not for profit or community benefit, but for the maintenance of hierarchy and the perpetuation of his personal power. And while the morality of his rule remains a subject of debate among historians and scholars of the wasteland, it is indisputable that Ashur's leadership enabled the survival and relative stability of Pittsburgh's population in a context where unchecked chaos, disease, and violence would have otherwise prevailed. And his rise demonstrates the intersection of skill, ideology, and opportunism in the formation of post-war societies, highlighting how individuals with knowledge, ambition, and ruthlessness can reshape devastated environments into functional, if brutal, social orders, and the legacy of Ashur's ascent persists not only in the historical record of the Pitt, but also in the social, industrial, and cultural structures that defined the city, illustrating the broader dynamics of post-apocalyptic governance, the interplay between authority and survival, and the enduring human capacity for both ingenuity and cruelty when confronted with the profound challenges of rebuilding civilization amidst the ruins of a nuclear world. By the time Ishmael Ashur had consolidated control over post-war Pittsburgh, the city had been transformed into a unique and brutal microcosm of post-apocalyptic civilization, a sprawling industrial landscape defined as much by the relentless operation of its steel mills and foundries as by the rigid social hierarchy that governed every aspect of life, and the population that survived the firestorms, radiation, and the Troglodyte Plague was now divided between those who labored endlessly in the furnaces and workshops and those who maintained authority over the production, enforcing Ashur's strict rules with a combination of discipline, intimidation, and reward. And in this environment, the concept of freedom had been all but erased, replaced by a system of coercion that was justified, in Ashur's philosophy, as necessary for survival and the continued functionality of the city, and the enslaved workforce, drawn from the survivors who had no alternative, became the lifeblood of the Pitt, tasked with mining the remaining ore, repairing machinery, and keeping the furnaces operational, often working under conditions of extreme heat, toxic smoke, and the constant threat of disease, while overseers and enforcers, loyal to Ashur, patrolled the workshops and streets, meting out punishment swiftly to ensure compliance, creating an atmosphere in which every action, every movement, and every moment of labor was regulated and scrutinized, and the air itself became a defining characteristic of the city, thick with smoke, soot, and the odor of burning metal, permeating every corner of the streets and dwellings, a constant reminder of both the productivity required to survive and the environmental degradation that had resulted from centuries of industrial activity and the catastrophic events of the Great War. And within this context, social mobility was virtually non-existent, as survival and status were intimately tied to one's usefulness to the industrial machinery and to the maintenance of Ashur's authority, with those who demonstrated skill, endurance, and obedience occasionally gaining marginal privileges, while those who failed, resisted, or fell ill were swiftly marginalized, exiled, or executed, reinforcing a rigid hierarchy in which value was measured almost exclusively in terms of labor contribution, compliance, and loyalty, and the psychological impact of this system on the population was profound, as fear, resignation, and adaptation became central to daily life, and the physical and social environment reinforced the perception that survival was inseparable from servitude, creating a culture in which the act of working in the furnaces and workshops was both a necessity and a moral imperative, an obligation to the community and to Ashur himself, whose presence loomed as both arbiter and overseer, a constant figure in the collective consciousness, whose authority was both absolute and unquestioned. And the maintenance of this system was facilitated not only by coercion, but also by ritualized routines, standardized labor practices, and strict enforcement of rules governing the pace, allocation, and distribution of work, creating a form of industrial governance that, while brutal, ensured the continuity of production and minimized chaos, and the city's architecture and urban design further reinforced this structure, with factories and foundries occupying the central and most protected areas, while residential quarters, storage areas, and slave accommodations were positioned according to proximity to work, control, and surveillance, ensuring that every movement of the population was predictable and manageable, and access to essential resources such as clean water, food, and medical treatment was similarly controlled, becoming instruments of both survival and social discipline, as Ashur and his enforcers could reward compliance or punish deviation through the allocation or withdrawal of necessities. A system that tightly bound survival to obedience and utility, and the enslaved laborers, despite enduring these extreme conditions, also developed adaptive social networks, communication methods, and subtle forms of resistance, reflecting the resilience of human social organization even under the harshest oppression, though such acts were carefully hidden and fraught with risk, as any perceived challenge to authority was met with swift and often lethal reprisal, and the presence of disease, accidents, and environmental hazards ensured that the population remained aware of the consequences of failure, while simultaneously reinforcing the necessity of collective effort and cooperation within the parameters set by Ashur's hierarchy. And within this framework, the Pitt functioned not merely as a city of surviving humans, but as an intricate system of industrial and social interdependence, where every furnace, conveyor, and machine was operated by human bodies bound to labor by necessity. Every overseer and administrator maintained the flow of production, and every element of the environment, from the rivers and bridges to the ruined streets and toxic air, served to regulate and contain the population. And while outsiders who would later arrive in the form of the lone wanderer would perceive the city as a dystopian nightmare, its functionality, durability, and continuity were a testament to the effectiveness of Ashur's organization, a grim demonstration that human societies can adapt and endure even under the most extreme conditions, provided that leadership, discipline, and coercion are applied with consistency and ruthlessness, and the operation of the city's industrial systems, combined with the social control mechanisms imposed by Ashur, ensured that the Pitt, despite its oppressive environment, remained a center of production and relative stability in the capital wasteland, a place where smoke and iron defined not only the physical landscape, but also the social, moral, and psychological contours of everyday life. And the existence of this city of slaves and smoke illustrates broader principles of post-apocalyptic governance, showing how survival, labor, and authority can be intertwined in ways that are both functional and morally complex, creating societies that persist against the odds, but at immense human cost. And ultimately, the Pitt stands as a stark historical record of the consequences of nuclear devastation, the emergence of authoritarian rule, and the enduring human capacity to endure, adapt, and be reshaped by circumstances of unparalleled hardship, demonstrating that the rebirth of civilization in the wasteland is rarely measured in freedom or comfort, but in the relentless operation of society under the shadow of survival and control, where every individual's value is dictated by utility and obedience, and where the smoke rising from the furnaces is both literal and symbolic, representing the fusion of industry, oppression, and the human will to endure in a world forever transformed by fire, plague, and the unyielding hand of its rulers. The journey from the capital wasteland to the industrial remnants of Pittsburgh, later known as the Pitt, was a trek fraught with peril, illustrating both the vast geographic challenges of post-nuclear America and the fragmented socio-political landscape that survivors had to navigate, beginning with the capital wasteland itself, a region of irradiated ruins, unstable structures, and dangerous wildlife, where the remnants of Washington, D.C., the suburbs, and outlying rural areas had been reduced to a patchwork of ruin, marked by collapsed buildings, abandoned highways, and scattered settlements struggling to maintain even rudimentary survival. And for those such as Wernher, a former slave from the Pitt, seeking to enlist outside assistance to overthrow Ashur's dominion, the journey required not only physical endurance, but acute awareness of the hazards inherent in traversing a landscape dominated by radiation, hostile factions, and the unpredictable movement of desperate survivors, scavengers, and raiders, as well as the mutated creatures that proliferated in the absence of natural predators, creating threats both large and small, from packs of feral dogs to irradiated wolves and more grotesque wildlife, whose aggression and unpredictability compounded the perils of travel, and navigation itself presented formidable obstacles, as roads were frequently impassable due to collapsed bridges, debris, or flooding, landmarks were altered or obliterated by fire and time, and maps, if available, were often incomplete or outdated, requiring travelers to rely on memory, observation, and improvisation, a necessity that favored those with local knowledge, survival experience, and adaptability, and the human element posed equal, if not greater, danger, as scattered communities, whether scavenger bands, raiders, or organized settlements like the settlements near Tenpenny Tower, or the surviving remnants of the Brotherhood of Steel, frequently resorted to ambush, extortion, or theft against travelers who could not prove both strength and value, a pattern that reflected the broader collapse of centralized authority and the rise of opportunistic, localized power structures throughout the wasteland. And the psychological toll of this journey was profound, as travelers contended with the constant stress of potential ambush, environmental hazards, radiation exposure, and the knowledge that misstep or miscalculation could result in injury or death with little hope of aid, compelling those like Wernher to adopt tactics of stealth, avoidance, and cautious engagement, employing weapons, traps, and alliances to mitigate risk, while simultaneously navigating moral decisions regarding who to trust, how to respond to pleas for help, and the use of force against other humans, reflecting the complex interplay between survival, pragmatism, and ethical considerations that characterized post-war behavior. And these challenges were compounded by the logistical difficulties of sustaining oneself during the journey, including the procurement of food and water, management of limited medical supplies, and maintenance of equipment, in a world where resources were scarce, contaminated, or damaged, requiring careful planning, rationing, and ingenuity. And the physical geography itself presented further trials, as travelers had to cross irradiated rivers, scale collapsed overpasses, traverse dense forested areas reclaimed by nature, and navigate urban ruins where unstable structures, hidden pits, and debris threatened both movement and safety. And all of these factors contributed to a profound shaping of both individual and group behavior, as only those capable of quick adaptation, precise observation, and disciplined decision-making could survive the multi-day, multi-week journey from the capital wasteland to Pittsburgh, a feat that underscored the broader theme of human resilience and ingenuity in the face of extreme environmental and social challenges. And upon their arrival at the outskirts of the pit, The contrast between the journey's dangers and the city's grim order became apparent, as the skeletal industrial structures, bridges, and forges of Pittsburgh loomed over a population already subordinated to Ashur's strict control, and Vernher's passage into the city not only represented the physical traversal of distance, but the crossing of moral and social boundaries, entering a society where survival was contingent upon compliance, labor, and careful negotiation of power, and his objective to seek external assistance highlighted the interconnectedness of wasteland regions, demonstrating how individual agency could influence larger socio-political dynamics, and how information, alliances, and intervention could alter the trajectory of post-war societies, as the arrival of outsiders like the lone wanderer had the potential to disrupt the delicate equilibrium of power, provide tools or knowledge to oppressed populations, and influence the placid outcomes of resistance movements, while also underscoring the risk inherent in such engagement, as intervention could provoke violent reprisals, unintended consequences, or escalation of conflict, and the journey from the capital wasteland to the pit thus exemplifies the broader realities of travel, survival, and socio-political interaction in the post-nuclear United States, illustrating the combination of environmental hazards, human threats, resource scarcity, and moral complexity that shaped both individual experiences and the structural dynamics of emergent societies. And the historical record of such journeys provides invaluable insight into the mechanisms by which post-war communities maintained continuity, asserted authority, and negotiated both internal cohesion and external interaction, highlighting how geography, environment, and human agency together dictated the possibilities and limitations of survival in the wasteland, and ultimately, the road from the capital wasteland to Pittsburgh was not merely a physical path, but a conduit through which ideas, alliances, and interventions could flow, shaping the future of the pit, influencing the balance of power within its industrial and social hierarchy, and establishing a precedent for the critical role of mobility, communication, and action in the broader history of post-apocalyptic human civilization, demonstrating that the success or failure of individuals navigating these paths had ramifications that extended far beyond their immediate survival, impacting entire communities, political structures, and the ongoing struggle between tyranny, oppression, and the pursuit of freedom in a world irrevocably altered by fire and fallout. The final approach to Pittsburgh, known to its inhabitants as the Pit, represented both a physical and symbolic threshold in the post-nuclear landscape, where the vast expanse of the wasteland gave way to a concentrated zone of industrial power, social stratification, and human adaptation. And for any traveler emerging from the hazardous journey across the capital wasteland, the city's ruins were immediately apparent, with skeletal factory towers rising through clouds of smoke, twisted girders bridging collapsed streets, and rivers blackened by industrial runoff, presenting a landscape simultaneously awe-inspiring and foreboding, and the entry points into the city, dominated by bridges and controlled thoroughfares, were strategically fortified and monitored, reflecting the highly organized, hierarchical society Ashur had imposed, where access was restricted and movement carefully regulated to maintain control over the enslaved population and protect industrial operations from both internal and external threats. And these structures were not merely physical barriers, but instruments of power, allowing Ashur and his enforcers to observe, intimidate, and direct all who approached, ensuring that the city remained insular and resilient despite the surrounding chaos. And the act of crossing into the pit required not only careful negotiation with guards, knowledge of social protocols, and awareness of environmental hazards, but also psychological preparation, as entrants would encounter the stark realities of a society constructed entirely around the interplay of labor, authority, and survival, where every building, furnace, and machine was a testament to human ingenuity harnessed under extreme duress. And the bridge itself, spanning the poisoned rivers that bisected the city, became a liminal space in which travelers were acutely aware of the transition from open, unpredictable wasteland to a controlled, hierarchical industrial enclave, where the balance between life and death, freedom and servitude was enforced by both human and environmental factors. And upon arrival, the first impressions were dominated by sensory extremes: the oppressive heat of the furnaces, the unrelenting din of machinery, the acrid odor of smoke and molten metal, the sight of enslaved laborers moving with disciplined efficiency, and the presence of armed overseers patrolling the streets, a tableau that communicated immediately the principles upon which Ashur's city operated. And it became apparent that survival here was inseparable from participation in the industrial economy, obedience to authority, and the negotiation of complex social hierarchies. And the city itself was divided both functionally and symbolically, with the most critical industrial centers located at the geographic core, residential quarters for laborers positioned nearby, and zones of supervision, administration, and enforcer housing strategically placed to maximize control and observation, reflecting a meticulously organized urban plan that optimized both production and social discipline. And the arrival of outsiders, such as Vernher or the lone wanderer, disrupted the otherwise predictable patterns of life, introducing elements of uncertainty, opportunity, and potential resistance into a system calibrated to maintain stasis through fear, labor, and the constant reinforcement of hierarchy. And the initial encounters between these travelers and the city's inhabitants were shaped by a combination of caution, curiosity, and self-preservation, as enslaved laborers assessed whether the newcomers could be allies, threats, or instruments for change, while enforcers evaluated the potential risk to Ashur's authority, demonstrating the intricate social calculations that governed interactions within the pit. And the arrival sequence also underscored the environmental hazards that continued to define life in the city, including unstable streets, toxic waste runoff, contaminated water sources, and residual radiation pockets, all of which required travelers to maintain vigilance and adapt strategies for movement, concealment, and engagement, further emphasizing the inseparability of physical, social, and psychological challenges within the post-apocalyptic industrial setting. And these conditions reinforced Ashur's dominance, as the city's structure and hazards amplified his ability to manipulate behavior, reward obedience, and punish disobedience, ensuring that even experienced travelers recognized the power dynamics embedded within the urban fabric, and the crossing of the bridge, therefore, represented not only a geographic transition, but an entry into a microcosm of post-war industrial society, a society where hierarchy, productivity, and survival were codified into daily routine, and where the historical trajectory from pre-war Pittsburgh to the Pitt could be read in every architectural remnant, in every operational furnace, and in every interaction between overseer and laborer, illustrating the continuity of human adaptation from the ashes of civilization and the arrival also marked the beginning of a critical phase for both Wernher and the Lone Wanderer, as they would soon confront the ethical, logistical, and tactical decisions required to navigate a society structured around slavery and survival, where their actions could influence the trajectory of revolt, the fate of the laboring population, and the consolidation or collapse of Ashur's power. And in studying the city from this vantage, historians and chroniclers of the wasteland later noted that the arrival at the Pitt exemplifies the broader themes of post-nuclear urban adaptation, demonstrating how geography, infrastructure, authority, and survival pressures interact to create complex social systems in which human agency, environmental constraints, and technological remnants intersect, providing insight into the mechanisms by which post-war societies establish order, maintain productivity, and regulate populations in conditions of extreme adversity. And ultimately, the crossing of the bridge into the Pit serves as both a literal and metaphorical threshold, marking the entrance into a city where life is inseparable from labor, obedience, and adaptation, and where every structural, social, and environmental element reinforces the authority of its ruler, illustrating in stark detail the consequences of nuclear devastation, the emergence of post-apocalyptic industrial governance, and the enduring interplay between human ingenuity, coercion, and survival in the capital wasteland. Within the sprawling industrial confines of the Pit, the enslaved population represented the backbone of the city's continued functionality, their labor sustaining the relentless operation of steel mills, workshops, and foundries, and their existence both shaped and was shaped by the harsh social hierarchy that Ishmael Ashur had meticulously imposed, where obedience, productivity, and utility to the ruling class dictated the contours of daily life, and the lived experience of these individuals provides critical insight into the human dimensions of post-apocalyptic industrial society as they navigated an environment defined by extreme heat, toxic smoke, contamination, and the constant threat of disease, injury, or punishment. And although their labor was essential to the survival of the city as a whole, the enslaved were subjected to a regimen that maximized output while minimizing individual agency, and they inhabited residential quarters constructed from salvaged materials, often cramped, poorly ventilated, and positioned in close proximity to the factories they were compelled to service, which further reinforced the interdependence of work, survival, and oversight, as the structures themselves acted as instruments of social control, restricting movement, concentrating populations, and allowing enforcers to monitor activity with efficiency and precision, and the daily routines imposed upon the enslaved population were both rigorous and ritualized, with schedules dictated by production quotas, breaks limited or eliminated, and infractions punished with severity, creating a rhythm of life that subordinated human needs to the demands of industrial continuity. And within this framework, small acts of adaptation, resistance, or cooperation emerged, ranging from covert communication between laborers to subtle manipulations of machinery or work output, all performed with an acute awareness of the risks posed by discovery. Yet these actions underscore the resilience of human ingenuity even under conditions of extreme oppression, and the psychological dimensions of slavery in the Pit were equally significant, as individuals negotiated the constant tension between fear and agency, submission and defiance, survival and moral compromise, and the pervasive presence of enforcers and overseers ensured that the social hierarchy remained visible, tangible, and inescapable reinforcing the internalization of obedience as both strategy and necessity, and the physical conditions of labor further shaped the experience of slavery, as workers endured temperatures exceeding safe limits, exposure to hazardous chemicals, repetitive strain from machinery, and the cumulative effects of radiation and poor nutrition, which together produced a workforce that was physically taxed, psychologically conditioned, and dependent upon both Ashur's rules and the limited provisions he allocated, and the disease environment, including the lingering effects of the Troglodyte Plague, compounded these pressures, with workers susceptible to infections that could spread rapidly in dense quarters, necessitating both informal self-policing among laborers and formal interventions by overseers, reinforcing the inseparability of health, productivity, and control. And in this context, social bonds among the enslaved emerged as a critical mechanism for endurance, as individuals formed networks of mutual support, shared knowledge, and covert communication, negotiating the balance between solidarity and the ever-present risk of punitive consequences. And the existence of these networks highlights the persistence of human sociality even under extreme coercion, illustrating how individuals adapt, not only physically, but socially and cognitively, to oppressive environments. And the labor itself, while brutal, was central to the material and symbolic identity of the pit, as the smoke, molten metal, and relentless machinery became both a measure of human productivity and a visible reminder of the hierarchies that governed life, reinforcing the perception that survival, contribution, and obedience were inseparable, and the role of enforcers and overseers in maintaining this system was critical, as they acted as the immediate agents of Ashur's authority, monitoring compliance, enforcing quotas, punishing deviation, and ensuring that the enslaved population remained both productive and docile, and their presence, often augmented by armed patrols, surveillance of workspaces, and public demonstrations of punishment, communicated the consequences of resistance while normalizing the operational hierarchy, embedding both fear and learned compliance into the social fabric of labor. And the experience of slavery in the pit also encompassed the moral and psychological dimensions of human behavior under duress, as enslaved individuals were compelled to reconcile the necessity of participation with the knowledge of injustice to find meaning, purpose, or survival strategies within a system designed to limit agency, and the constant negotiation between submission, resistance, and endurance created a complex cultural landscape in which acts of ingenuity, compassion, and solidarity persisted alongside fear, resentment, and adaptation, illustrating the multifaceted nature of human response to extreme environmental and social pressures, and the presence of outsiders, whether Werner seeking assistance or the lone wanderer traversing the city, introduced additional layers of complexity, as enslaved individuals assessed whether these newcomers represented opportunity, threat, or instruments of change, with the potential to alter the balance of power, spark rebellion, or provide crucial resources, while simultaneously navigating the imperatives of secrecy and survival and the combination of environmental hazards, oppressive social structures, and the constant need for productivity ensured that life among the slaves of the pit was an intricate interplay of labor, authority, adaptation, and endurance, a microcosm of the broader post-apocalyptic human condition, demonstrating both the extremes of oppression and the persistent capacity for resilience, innovation, and human connection. And ultimately, studying the lives of these individuals provides a lens through which to understand the mechanisms of post-war social order, the consequences of industrial and authoritarian control, and the ways in which human beings navigate, endure, and sometimes subvert systems designed to extract labor while limiting autonomy, thereby highlighting the enduring intersection of survival, morality, and social structure in the most extreme conditions imposed by nuclear devastation and the imperatives of authoritarian industrial governance. Within the social and industrial structure of the pit, the existence of the whole, an arena of blood and spectacle, represents one of the most extreme and vivid expressions of Ashur's authority. The city's integration of violence, entertainment, and social control, and the institution of the whole exemplifies the ways in which post-apocalyptic societies can manipulate human psychology to maintain order and assert dominance, as this arena was not merely a site of amusement, but a carefully calibrated instrument of governance, designed to channel aggression, fear, and desperation into a controlled environment where authority, hierarchy, and survival were made manifest, and the origins of the whole can be traced to both pre-war cultural practices of public combat and post-war necessity, as Ashur recognized that the enslaved population, while essential to industrial productivity, also possessed human impulses toward resistance, frustration, and rebellion, and that left unchecked, these impulses could undermine social cohesion, reduce efficiency, and threaten his control. And by creating a regulated space where conflict could be expressed, observed, and ultimately controlled, Ashur transformed potentially destabilizing energies into a means of reinforcing hierarchy and submission, and the physical environment of the whole, a partially enclosed space constructed from salvaged metal, concrete, and steel girders, with observation platforms for overseers and Ashur's representatives, served multiple purposes, providing a confined and surveilled location where combatants could be engaged safely from the perspective of rulers, while simultaneously demonstrating the consequences of failure, disobedience, or weakness to all who watched, reinforcing both fear and compliance within the wider population. And participation in the arena was typically involuntary for those enslaved or accused of transgression, though occasional voluntary combatants emerged, seeking to assert skill, gain favor, or achieve minor status, and the fights themselves were often brutal, involving weapons, improvised armaments, and environmental hazards designed to maximize both spectacle and lethality, reflecting the broader ethos of the pit, where labor, obedience, and survival were inseparable from danger and coercion, and the psychological impact of the arena on both participants and spectators was profound, embedding the dynamics of power, mortality, and spectacle into the collective consciousness, as every blow, injury, and death communicated lessons about authority, hierarchy, and human vulnerability, reinforcing Ashur's position while simultaneously providing a controlled outlet for aggression and tension, and the observation of the whole offered insights into both the operational and social mechanics of the pit, revealing how authority could be maintained not merely through labor supervision and resource control, but through carefully orchestrated psychological reinforcement, where fear, awe, and the spectacle of punishment served as tools of governance as potent as any physical restraint. And the arena also functioned as a social microcosm, highlighting the stark divisions within the city, between overseers and slaves, the physically capable and the weak, and between those whose compliance ensured survival and those whose transgressions resulted in immediate, violent consequences, and the emergent norms of behavior within this environment including the demonstration of skill, endurance, and strategic thinking in combat, the negotiation of alliances, and the management of fear and risk illustrate the adaptive strategies human beings develop in response to extreme oppression, reinforcing the broader theme of resilience amid coercion. And in addition to its social and psychological functions, the whole was intertwined with the economic and industrial imperatives of the Pit, as Ashur leveraged the arena to manage productivity indirectly, offering minor rewards, privileges, or exemptions to victors, and demonstrating that value and utility extended beyond labor output into other domains, where human skills and endurance could be measured, evaluated, and exploited for the maintenance of social control. And the presence of the arena further communicated the omnipresence of surveillance and the consequences of deviation from prescribed behavior, ensuring that both participants and spectators internalized the rules of the city, the inevitability of judgment, and the omnipotence of the ruling authority, while simultaneously embedding a culture in which life was precarious, performance was constant, and survival required both skill and compliance. And the institution of the whole also illustrates the ways in which post-apocalyptic societies can synthesize elements of pre-war culture, environmental necessity, and authoritarian strategy to create institutions that serve multiple functional, social, and psychological purposes, transforming violence from a destabilizing threat into a tool of governance, cultural reinforcement, and social cohesion. And the historical record demonstrates that the arena was both feared and normalized among the enslaved population, a stark manifestation of the limits of autonomy, the consequences of resistance, and the interdependence of survival and obedience in the pit, while simultaneously offering insights into human ingenuity, adaptation, and the capacity to endure and navigate extreme social hierarchies. And the lessons of the whole, as both a physical and symbolic institution, resonate beyond its immediate context, providing evidence of the mechanisms by which post-nuclear urban societies enforce order, regulate populations, and integrate the human propensity for competition, aggression, and spectacle into the broader framework of survival, authority, and industrial necessity, making it a critical site for understanding the intersection of labor, coercion, culture, and human resilience within one of the most strikingly organized and oppressive environments of the Fallout universe. And ultimately, the arena stands as both a testament to the extremes of human social engineering under duress and a cautionary illustration of the ways in which survival, spectacle, and authority can be intertwined to sustain a society constructed from the ashes of pre-war civilization, where every act, movement, and interaction is subsumed under the imperatives of control, productivity, and the demonstration of power, and where the blood spilled within its confines reinforces the ever-present lesson that in the pit, life and death, labor and obedience, fear and resilience are inextricably bound. At the apex of the pit, both geographically and symbolically, stood the tower, a structure built from the remnants of pre-war industrial architecture, fortified with salvaged steel, concrete, and the labor of countless enslaved workers. And it was within this edifice that Ishmael Ashur exercised the ultimate consolidation of his authority, a physical manifestation of his dominion over the city, its industrial mechanisms, and the human lives contained within its smoke-choked streets, and the tower's interior, a labyrinth of offices, observation platforms, and surveillance rooms allowed Ashur to monitor the laborers, oversee production, and maintain the precise balance between coercion and productivity that had defined his rule for decades, and the confrontation with Ashur that awaited any outsider or internal dissident was not merely a physical encounter, but a complex ideological challenge, as the tower embodied the tension between survival, authority, and moral responsibility in a world reshaped by nuclear devastation, where decisions were rarely clear-cut, and every action carried profound consequences. And within the highest chambers of the tower, Ashur's family, his wife and child, served as both symbols of continuity and instruments of psychological leverage, representing the personal stakes that bound him to his system of control, illustrating the ways in which human relationships could be manipulated to reinforce power, loyalty, and obedience. And the arrival of Vernher and the lone wanderer at this apex precipitated a confrontation that was as much about ideology as it was about authority, bringing into focus the fundamental questions of post-war governance, the ethics of slavery, and the competing visions of civilization in a landscape defined by destruction and scarcity. And Ashur's arguments, articulated with the measured rhetoric of someone who had witnessed and endured the collapse of society, emphasized that the survival of the city, the maintenance of order, and the protection of human life in the industrial zone required strict hierarchical control, disciplined labor, and the integration of human labor into functional production systems, while he positioned himself as a pragmatic savior whose methods, though harsh, were designed to ensure that Pittsburgh remained a functioning industrial enclave capable of enduring the chaos of the wasteland, and this ideology was placed in direct tension with Vernher's vision, one that prioritized freedom, moral accountability, and the eradication of oppression, highlighting the clash between utilitarian survival, which justified coercion and cruelty, and ethical liberation, which demanded risk, upheaval, and the potential for chaos. And the physical environment of the tower itself amplified this confrontation as its vantage points overlooked the furnaces, workshops, and riverways of the city, providing tangible evidence of the scale of Ashur's achievement and the dependence of the population on the very system being questioned, with every glance downward reinforcing the stakes of the ideological debate, while the oppressive heat, the hum of machinery, and the omnipresent smoke reminded all present of the interdependence of labor, environment, and authority. And the presence of Ashur's family added an additional layer of human complexity to the confrontation, as the ruler's motivations were revealed to be intertwined with the protection and perpetuation of his lineage, creating a moral and emotional dimension that complicated the assessment of his character, blending elements of paternal instinct, ego, and political strategy, and the dialogue, negotiation, and potential confrontation within the tower reflected the larger themes of Fallout 3. The Pit, namely that rebuilding civilization in the wasteland necessitated difficult ethical choices, the reconciliation of survival with morality, and the acknowledgement that power, whether exercised benevolently or tyrannically, was inseparable from the human condition in a post-nuclear environment. And the confrontation also illuminated the mechanisms through which Ashur maintained control: surveillance, strategic allocation of resources, physical domination of industrial centers, manipulation of the labor force, and the deliberate orchestration of fear and reward, all of which combined to create a social order resilient to internal dissent, yet deeply contingent on the continued obedience and exploitation of the enslaved population. And the ideological clash crystallized when Vernher, representing both the human desire for liberation and the enduring moral imperative to confront injustice, directly challenged Ashur's authority, questioning the legitimacy of coercion as a means of survival, the morality of slavery, and the ethical cost of maintaining industrial production at the expense of freedom. And the tension between these worldviews highlighted the philosophical core of the Pitt narrative, illustrating that in post-apocalyptic societies, decisions are rarely morally neutral, and the distinction between tyrant and savior often depends on perspective, circumstance, and the weighting of competing imperatives. And within this high-stakes environment, the observer or participant was forced to reconcile the tangible benefits of order, survival, and production with the intangible but profound costs to human dignity, autonomy, and ethical principle. A balance that would ultimately define the outcome of the city's future, and the tower thus served, not merely as a fortress of authority, but as a stage for the dramatic and existential exploration of power, morality, and survival, where every decision carried consequences for life, death, and the trajectory of civilization itself. And the confrontation with Ashur underscored that in the Pit, the line between coercion and protection, tyranny and leadership, was not easily drawn, and the resolution of this encounter, whether through negotiation, persuasion, or violent overthrow, was emblematic of the broader dilemmas inherent in post-nuclear governance, reflecting both the resilience and the fragility of human societies when faced with the dual imperatives of survival and ethical responsibility. And historians studying the Pit later emphasized that the tower confrontation was a defining moment not only for the city itself, but also for the wider capital wasteland, as it crystallized the choices, sacrifices, and ethical challenges faced by those seeking to navigate, reform, or overthrow post-apocalyptic social structures, providing enduring lessons on the complexities of power, the consequences of moral compromise, and the intricate interplay between human agency, environmental constraints, and social engineering in a world forever altered by fire, radiation, and the collapse of pre-war civilization. And the narrative of the tower and the tyrant ultimately illustrates the duality of post-nuclear society, the capacity for human ingenuity and organization to preserve life and order, and the simultaneous potential for cruelty, exploitation, and oppression to dominate the mechanisms of governance, leaving the inhabitants of the Pit, the observers, and the chroniclers with a profound understanding of the costs, compromises, and consequences of rebuilding civilization under extreme conditions, where the distinction between hero and tyrant is measured not only by outcomes, but by the ethical and moral framework through which those outcomes are pursued, and where the legacy of every action resonates across the industrial furnaces, enslaved laborers, and smoke-filled streets, binding the history of the Pit to both human resilience and the enduring shadows of coercion, control, and power. In the heart of the post-apocalyptic industrial enclave of the Pit, the birth of Mary, the daughter of Ishmael Ashur and Sandra Kundanika, represents not only a rare instance of life amidst devastation, but also a pivotal fulcrum around which questions of science, morality, and survival revolve. For Marie, born less than a year prior to the events of 2277, possesses a natural resistance to both radiation and the troglodyte degeneration contagion, a unique physiological trait that immediately elevated her from the status of a mere infant to a critical subject of study by her parents, who, recognizing the potential of her immunity, began methodically observing, recording, and analyzing her biological responses with the intention of developing a cure that could potentially reverse or halt the spread of the troglodyte virus. And this scientific focus transforms Marie from a vulnerable newborn into a linchpin in the ongoing struggle to reconcile human survival with ethical responsibility, as her very existence challenges both the morality of experimentation on human subjects and the desperate pragmatism required to combat the persistent disease that threatens the city's population. And while the Pitt's environment remains lethally inhospitable, characterized by smoke-choked streets, toxic industrial runoff, and the omnipresent danger of infected laborers, the relative safety of Haven, the small sanctuary where Marie is raised under her parents' supervision, allows for controlled observation and protection, creating a microcosm of security and careful ethical consideration in an otherwise chaotic and oppressive landscape. And the deliberate attention Ashur and Sandra devote to monitoring Marie underscores the tension inherent in post-nuclear human societies between parental responsibility, scientific ambition, and the broader ethical implications of experimenting with life in a bid to save many at the potential cost of one. For their methods, while guided by a genuine desire to produce a cure, require careful balancing of risk, exposure, and the infant's well-being, reflecting the extraordinary pressures placed upon those seeking to mediate survival, knowledge, and morality under conditions of extreme duress. And Marie's natural resistance also introduces complex social and political ramifications, as her immunity symbolizes hope for the enslaved and afflicted populations, a potential tool for negotiation or leverage within the city's fragile hierarchies, and a reminder of the extraordinary human potential that can arise even in the midst of systemic cruelty. Yet it also carries inherent danger, as knowledge of her existence and abilities could provoke intervention, coercion, or exploitation by those seeking to maintain control, gain advantage, or accelerate scientific progress without regard to ethical limits. And the very act of safeguarding Marie thus becomes intertwined with questions of trust, authority, and rebellion, as the lone wanderer, Wernher, and other outsiders must navigate the dual imperatives of protecting the child while influencing or participating in the larger struggle against Ashur's oppressive regime, highlighting the extent to which a single life can affect political, social, and moral dynamics in a post-nuclear city. And the study of Marie's immunity also provides insight into the mechanisms of human resilience in extreme environments, demonstrating how rare biological traits, when carefully observed and ethically applied, can yield critical solutions to otherwise intractable problems, while simultaneously serving as a moral mirror reflecting the consequences of human ambition, parental responsibility, and the ethical treatment of vulnerable individuals. And as scholars and historians of post-war society would later note, the presence of Marie underscores the duality of hope and responsibility in nuclear wastelands, showing that the survival of a single child can influence decisions, inspire action, and shape the ethical landscape of an entire community, as the potential cure derived from her natural resistance offers a tangible path to liberation from disease, while simultaneously raising profound questions about the limits of human intervention and the costs of survival. And the implications of Marie's life extend beyond her immediate protection, as the methods developed by her parents to study her immunity, including controlled observation, careful monitoring of exposure, and incremental experimentation, form the foundation for potential medical breakthroughs, while illustrating the moral tightrope walked by those who wield knowledge in service of both preservation and humanistic objectives, and the very act of existing as an infant in Haven transforms Marie into a symbol of continuity, biological possibility, and the enduring human drive to overcome adversity, providing a focal point for narrative, moral, and historical reflection within the Pit. As her immunity challenges assumptions about human vulnerability, the inevitability of disease, and the role of individual agency in shaping outcomes, and her parents' actions, motivated by a combination of paternal instinct, scientific curiosity, and ethical concern, further highlight the ways in which post-nuclear human societies negotiate the boundaries of morality, responsibility, and the pursuit of knowledge, particularly when confronted with the dual imperatives of combating a devastating contagion and protecting the most vulnerable. And ultimately, Marie's presence in the narrative of the Pit embodies the convergence of hope, ethical reflection, and the practical realities of survival, illustrating that even in a world defined by smoke, steel, disease, and coercion, the potential for new life, immunity, and transformative scientific understanding can serve as a catalyst for moral action, social negotiation, and the reimagining of what is possible within a devastated human landscape, leaving an enduring legacy that emphasizes both the fragility and the extraordinary potential of life in a post-nuclear environment, and ensuring her protection, observing her natural resistance, and considering the moral and practical ramifications of her existence, collectively underscore the critical role that infants and vulnerable individuals play in shaping both historical and ethical outcomes, demonstrating that the Pit, while dominated by industry, oppression, and disease, contains within it the seeds of renewal, knowledge, and hope embodied most vividly in the child, whose very biology may hold the key to saving countless lives, while simultaneously testing the moral and ethical limits of those who seek to use, protect, and learn from her in the ongoing struggle to reclaim humanity amidst devastation. The ignition of rebellion within the Pit represents one of the most pivotal moments in the city's post-nuclear history, a convergence of oppression, desperation, and human resilience that transformed the calculated, hierarchical control established by Ishmael Ashur into a volatile arena of revolt, and the conditions that precipitated this uprising were rooted in decades of enforced labor, pervasive fear, and the cruel orchestration of social hierarchy, where the enslaved population, subjected to the relentless demands of the steel mills, workshops, and foundries, had internalized both the mechanisms of obedience and the latent desire for freedom, and the intervention of Werner and the lone wanderer, armed with knowledge of the Troglodyte Plague cure and driven by the ethical imperative to challenge tyranny, acted as catalysts that converted simmering resentment and covert dissent into coordinated action, demonstrating the critical interplay between external agency, local knowledge, and latent social tension in triggering collective upheaval. And the rebellion itself unfolded across multiple fronts, as laborers in the furnaces and workshops ceased compliance, sabotaged machinery, and, in some instances, engaged directly with enforcers and armed overseers, converting industrial tools into instruments of both resistance and survival, while the city's infrastructure, bridges, elevated walkways, and observation platforms became strategic battlegrounds that shaped the tactical dynamics of the revolt, amplifying the stakes for both insurgents and loyalist enforcers, and the chaos of the uprising was intensified by the environmental conditions of the Pit, where smoke, molten metal, toxic runoff, and the constant threat of fire and structural collapse created an atmosphere of extreme danger, forcing participants to navigate hazards that were both natural and man-made. And the strategic use of the city's verticality, industrial machinery, and knowledge of hidden passages by insurgents reflected the ingenuity, adaptability, and courage required to confront a highly organized, authoritarian regime, demonstrating that survival under extreme oppression depends not only on physical capacity, but on understanding and exploiting the environment, and the psychological dimensions of the rebellion were equally significant, as fear, hope, anger, and moral conviction intersected in every decision, whether to strike, hide, negotiate, or protect fellow laborers, creating a complex moral calculus in which each action carried immediate and potentially lethal consequences, while also influencing the broader trajectory of the revolt and the survival of both individuals and groups. And the rebellion further exposed the vulnerabilities of Ashur's regime, as the absolute authority he had maintained through surveillance, coercion, and strategic allocation of resources was challenged by the collective action of those whose labor had been essential to the city's operation, revealing the delicate balance upon which authoritarian industrial systems depend, and the confrontation between the insurgents and Ashur's loyal enforcers underscored the dynamic interaction between structure, agency, and resistance, demonstrating that even the most rigid hierarchies are susceptible to disruption when those within the system mobilize with purpose, coordination, and shared objective, and the uprising was complicated by divergent goals among the participants. As some sought revenge against Ashur personally, some aimed to dismantle the institution of slavery, and others were motivated by the immediate practical goal of survival, highlighting the multiplicity of human motives in post-apocalyptic social movements and the necessity of leadership, communication, and strategy in shaping outcomes, and the presence of the lone wanderer acted as a force multiplier, offering knowledge, skills, and resources that could tip the balance in favor of the rebels, while Vernher's personal quest for vengeance added a moral and emotional dimension to the struggle, demonstrating the intertwined roles of individual agency and collective action in shaping historical events. And the rebellion unfolded with a series of violent confrontations, the destruction of key machinery, the seizure of strategic positions, and the deliberate subversion of Ashur's control mechanisms, forcing both the ruler and his enforcers to respond under extreme pressure, often revealing cracks in the carefully maintained hierarchy, the limits of coercive authority, and the dependence of the city on the labor and compliance of its enslaved population. And throughout these events, the enslaved population demonstrated resilience, ingenuity, and moral courage, negotiating the risks of direct combat, sabotage, and insubordination with an acute awareness of both immediate survival and long-term implications for the city's social and industrial systems. And the uprising ultimately functioned as both a literal and symbolic contest over control of the pit, illustrating the enduring tension between oppression and autonomy, coercion and moral responsibility, and survival and freedom. And historians analyzing the rebellion have emphasized that its causes, conduct, and consequences provide profound insight into the mechanics of post-nuclear governance, the fragility of hierarchical control under extreme conditions, and the capacity of human beings to resist, adapt, and assert agency even when constrained by extreme environmental, social, and political pressures. And the outcomes of the rebellion were shaped not only by the immediate tactical decisions of participants, but also by the ethical choices made by key actors, including the lone wanderer whose interventions could preserve life, punish tyranny, or escalate violence depending on strategic and moral considerations, and the rebellion's effects rippled across the city, disrupting production, weakening Ashur's authority, emboldening enslaved workers, and ultimately forcing a confrontation that would determine the political, social, and moral trajectory of the Pitt. And the narrative of this uprising illustrates that in post-apocalyptic societies, the balance of power is never absolute, that oppression can be resisted, and that collective action, when catalyzed by knowledge, ethical imperative, and courage, has the potential to reshape entire social systems, providing a cautionary yet instructive case study for understanding the dynamics of revolt, authority, and survival in environments defined by scarcity, hazard, and extreme social stratification. And the rebellion ignited in the Pitt therefore serves as both a historical and moral lesson, that even under conditions of extreme control and oppression, human agency, ingenuity, and ethical action can disrupt established hierarchies, challenge tyranny, and open the possibility for the reconfiguration of civilization, where the flames of revolt, the smoke of industry, and the courage of the oppressed converge to redefine the destiny of a city forged in fire, steel, and human endurance. The climax of the Pitt's narrative is marked by the divergent outcomes of human agency, moral deliberation, and social upheaval, crystallized in the fallout of choice, a period in which the consequences of rebellion, leadership, and ethical decision-making are rendered tangible, illustrating the profound implications of power exercised in a post-nuclear environment. And this chapter of history is defined by the contrasting potentialities that emerge from the player character's engagement with Vernher, Ashur, and the enslaved population, whose fates hang in delicate equilibrium, dependent on strategic decisions, ethical considerations, and the capacity to navigate the intertwined imperatives of survival, morality, and social reconstruction. And the two primary trajectories, Vernher's takeover or Ashur's continued rule, exemplify the profound influence of individual choice in shaping collective destiny, reflecting the broader post-apocalyptic principle that authority, social order, and the distribution of human suffering and opportunity are never neutral, but are instead the cumulative result of human agency, circumstance, and moral vision. And if Vernher's path is chosen, the city undergoes a transformative reconfiguration. As the tyrannical hierarchy imposed by Ashur collapses, the enslaved population is liberated, and industrial operations are either restructured for equitable distribution or temporarily disrupted in the pursuit of social justice. And this transition, while morally affirmative, carries immediate risks, including the potential for industrial sabotage, residual violence from loyalist enforcers, and the challenge of maintaining functional production systems in the absence of a singular authoritarian authority. And the historical record demonstrates that Vernher's ascension reflects the complex balance between ethical action and pragmatic governance, as the liberation of labor and assertion of human dignity require simultaneous attention to material necessities, infrastructure stabilization, and the management of social cohesion to prevent post-rebellion fragmentation or collapse. And in contrast, the decision to allow Ashur to retain power, whether through negotiated compromise, coerced loyalty, or the reinforcement of his authority by force, preserves the operational integrity of the Pitt's industrial complex, but perpetuates the systemic oppression, ethical compromise, and social stratification that have defined the city for decades, highlighting the moral ambiguity inherent in post-apocalyptic governance, where the preservation of production, order, and survival can conflict with fundamental human rights, autonomy, and justice, and the consequences of this choice reverberate through every layer of society, affecting enslaved workers, enforcers, external observers, and the broader capital wasteland, as the continuity or disruption of Ashur's regime shapes trade routes, social networks, and the perception of industrial governance as either coercive or resilient. And the fallout of choice is therefore not merely a narrative device, but a historical phenomenon, illustrating the intersection of ethics, strategy, and survival in extreme conditions. And chroniclers of the Pit have noted that the dual outcomes exemplify the principle that in post-nuclear human settlements, the repercussions of decision-making extend beyond immediate material or physical consequences to encompass moral, social, and psychological dimensions, influencing behavior, expectation, and the social contract for generations, and the process by which these outcomes are realized through the mobilization of rebellion, negotiation with authority, tactical engagement, and the application of ethical reasoning, demonstrates that historical trajectory in post-apocalyptic environments is contingent, emergent, and profoundly shaped by the interplay between individual initiative and collective action, and the resulting conditions, whether under Werner's vision of freedom or Ashur's continued dominion, illuminate broader truths about the post-war human condition, including the persistent tension between survival imperatives and ethical obligation, the necessity of balancing material and moral priorities, and the enduring challenge of reconstructing civilization from the ashes of destruction. And the fallout of choice also underscores the role of knowledge, particularly that of Marie, and the cure to the Troglodyte Plague as a decisive factor in determining the success, sustainability, and ethical character of each potential outcome, illustrating how access to scientific understanding can transform strategic possibilities and moral landscapes. And the historiography of the Pit emphasizes that these choices and their consequences provide critical insight into the mechanisms of power, resistance, and social reconstruction in post-nuclear contexts, demonstrating that liberation, oppression, and societal cohesion are not inevitable but contingent upon the convergence of ethical judgment, tactical execution, and the adaptive responses of populations under extreme duress. And in examining the divergent paths, historians note that Werner's rule symbolizes the capacity for ethical intervention, social reorganization, and humanistic governance, albeit accompanied by practical hazards and uncertainties, while Ashur's continued rule represents the persistence of authoritarian control, operational efficiency, and structured production at the cost of systemic moral compromise. And these dualities serve as enduring lessons in the consequences of choice, emphasizing that post-apocalyptic societies are shaped as much by human decision-making and ethical frameworks as by environmental constraints, material scarcity, and technological capacity. And the fallout of choice in the Pit, therefore, encapsulates the intricate interplay between morality, power, survival, and the reconstruction of civilization, illustrating that the post-nuclear human condition is defined not merely by the capacity to endure environmental and social hazards, but by the moral and strategic decisions that dictate the fate of communities, the distribution of suffering and opportunity, and the long-term trajectory of human settlement and governance. And ultimately, this chapter in the history of the Pit stands as a testament to the enduring significance of agency, the weight of ethical responsibility, and the profound consequences that arise when human beings are tasked with shaping civilization from the remnants of annihilation, where every decision, whether to liberate or to dominate, to disrupt or to preserve, leaves indelible marks upon the people, infrastructure, and moral fabric of a society forged in fire, steel, and human endurance, underscoring the enduring lesson that, in the wasteland, choice is both a tool and a burden, capable of forging freedom or perpetuating tyranny. And the legacy of these decisions continues to inform both the lived reality of the Pitt's population and the historical understanding of post-nuclear human governance, resilience, and ethical responsibility. The events that unfolded within the Pit did not remain confined to the steel-choked streets and smoke-filled furnaces of the city itself, but reverberated throughout the wider capital wasteland and beyond, producing consequences that rippled across trade routes, influenced the strategic calculations of the Brotherhood of Steel, and reshaped the perceptions of human governance, survival, and morality in post-nuclear America. And the nature of these echoes can be traced to both the immediate outcomes of the rebellion and the longer-term consequences of ethical and strategic decisions made by key actors, including Werner, Ashur, the lone wanderer, and the enslaved population, as the collapse or preservation of Ashur's authority altered the flow of resources, the security of industrial output, and the potential for social unrest in adjacent regions, and traders and scavengers who traveled the rivers and roadways connecting the Pit to the capital wasteland and surrounding territories, carried first-hand accounts of the rebellion, the liberation or continued oppression of the labor force, and the shifts in industrial productivity, thereby transmitting not only tangible commodities, but also crucial information that shaped economic networks, alliance formation, and the strategic behavior of both organized factions and independent groups across the region, and the Brotherhood of Steel, already attentive to the distribution of technology, power, and knowledge in the post-nuclear landscape, incorporated these reports into their assessment of regional stability, evaluating the potential for intervention, the threat posed by the continuation of oppressive regimes, and the opportunities for establishing or reinforcing authority, demonstrating the interplay between local events and macro-level organizational strategy, and the reverberations also extended to the perception of industrialized urban centers as loci of both opportunity and risk, highlighting the potential benefits of accessing infrastructure, resources, and skilled labor, while simultaneously emphasizing the dangers posed by entrenched authoritarian control, disease, and social unrest, and for the enslaved or liberated populations who participated in or witnessed the upheaval. The lessons of the Pit informed their understanding of agency, solidarity, and the mechanisms by which humans can assert control over both their environment and their social conditions, reinforcing patterns of cooperation, cautious opportunism, and resistance that would shape subsequent migrations, settlements, and insurgent activities. And the ripple effects of the Pitt's events were not solely material or strategic, but also deeply cultural and psychological, as the narratives of heroism, cruelty, and ethical decision-making propagated across communities, influencing norms, expectations, and moral frameworks, with tales of liberation inspiring similar challenges to authority elsewhere, while stories of coercion and brutality served as warnings regarding the limits of autonomy and the consequences of rebellion, and the geographical dispersion of these lessons across rivers, roads, and settlements demonstrates the ways in which information, ethics, and human experience are intertwined in the post-apocalyptic environment, shaping both local practices and broader regional understanding. And the echoes of the Pit also highlighted the fragility and interdependence of human societies in the wasteland, as the collapse of Ashur's regime, or its maintenance under continued rebellion, created cascading effects that influenced labor stability, resource allocation, industrial output, and even the epidemiology of residual threats, like the Troglodyte Plague, emphasizing that localized events can have outsized impacts on the interconnected web of post-nuclear civilization, and the interactions between liberated workers, external observers, and surviving enforcers further demonstrated the emergent complexity of social networks under stress, as newly freed individuals negotiated trade, alliances, and protection, while retaining the memory of subjugation and the lessons learned from the exercise of power, coercion, and moral choice. And the historiography of the Pit emphasizes that the city's story and the subsequent echoes throughout the wasteland offers critical insight into the dynamics of resilience, ethical decision-making, and governance under conditions of extreme hazard, scarcity, and social hierarchy, illustrating that even a single urban center, when subjected to rebellion, moral crisis, and the intervention of informed actors, can influence regional stability, resource flow, and the evolution of social norms. And the long-term consequences of these echoes are evident in trade networks that adjusted to new centers of production, in the Brotherhood of Steel's strategic deployment of forces and surveillance, in the behavior of independent settlements that recalibrated their problems, approach to both labor and authority, and in the moral consciousness of communities that had previously regarded tyranny, survival, and coercion as immutable realities, and the cumulative impact of the Pitt's rebellion, the ethical choices surrounding Marie's secret, and the potential outcomes of Vernher's or Ashur's dominance contributed to a broader understanding of how post-nuclear societies adapt to, resist, and propagate systems of power, authority, and morality, providing case studies for the resilience of human social organization, the fragility of authoritarian structures, and the enduring importance of ethical judgment, strategic foresight, and collective action. And the echoes across the wasteland ultimately demonstrate that events within a single city, though geographically bounded, have ramifications that extend far beyond local confines, shaping perceptions, influencing decision-making, and altering the trajectory of interconnected communities, factions, and economies, thereby illustrating that the study of the Pit is not solely a localized historical inquiry, but a window into the mechanisms by which human beings reconstruct civilization, negotiate power, and project influence across a devastated landscape. And the lessons of these echoes continue to inform our understanding of the balance between oppression and liberation, authority and resistance, survival and ethical responsibility, reinforcing the principle that the consequences of human action in post-nuclear societies are both immediate and far-reaching, both material and moral, both strategic and deeply personal, and that the story of the Pit resonates across the wasteland as a testament to the enduring power of choice, courage, and the indelible imprint of human agency under extreme conditions. The legacy of the Pit endures not merely in the physical remnants of its steel mills, bridges, and smoke-choked streets, nor solely in the scattered records of rebellion, governance, and survival, but in the broader philosophical and sociological lessons that it imparts regarding the reconstruction of civilization under conditions of extreme duress, the interplay between tyranny and liberation, and the indelible imprint of human choice on the post-nuclear landscape. And, at its core, the Pitt exemplifies the paradox of civilization forged through cruelty, a city whose very existence is contingent upon the extraction of labor, the imposition of hierarchy, and the enforcement of obedience, yet simultaneously shaped by the ethical, strategic, and moral interventions of individuals who challenge, negotiate, or reshape the structures of authority, and the divergent outcomes that emerged from the rebellion, the administration of the Troglodyte Plague cure, and the ultimate fate of Ashur and Werner illustrate the profound influence of human agency, revealing that in the aftermath of nuclear devastation, the trajectory of entire communities, economies, and ethical frameworks can hinge on the decisions of a few key actors, whose choices reverberate across generations, social networks, and regional systems. And the philosophical resonance of the Pitt lies in its demonstration that survival, productivity, and social order are not sufficient alone to define civilization, that the ethical dimension of governance, the moral character of leadership, and the respect for human autonomy are equally vital, and that the exercise of power without accountability, no matter how effective in maintaining industrial output, carries long-term consequences for social cohesion, human dignity, and cultural memory. And historians, philosophers, and chroniclers studying the Pitt have emphasized that the city serves as both a cautionary tale and a model of post-apocalyptic adaptation, illustrating that cruelty can be instrumental in constructing functional societies, yet simultaneously undermines the moral legitimacy necessary for sustainable governance. And the lessons of the Pitt extend beyond its immediate geography, as trade networks, regional alliances, and factional strategies in the capital wasteland and surrounding territories were fundamentally influenced by the outcomes of rebellion, the restructuring of labor, and the choices regarding ethical intervention, with each decision creating ripple effects that altered perceptions of authority, the viability of industrialized settlements, and the moral expectations of both rulers and ruled. And the city's legacy is further complicated by the presence of enduring human resilience, ingenuity, and solidarity, as enslaved populations demonstrated the capacity to organize, resist, and adapt under extreme conditions, revealing that even in environments structured around oppression, human beings retain agency, creativity, and moral judgment, qualities that can both challenge authority and catalyze transformative social change. And the ethical dilemmas confronted within the Pitt, whether concerning the fate of Ashur, the distribution of the Troglodyte Plague cure, or the decision to prioritize survival versus liberation, underscore the persistent tension between utilitarian pragmatism and moral responsibility, a tension that defines post-nuclear governance and remains a central concern for observers, participants, and historians. And the city's industrial infrastructure, while physically impressive and essential to the survival of its inhabitants, serves as a double-edged symbol, a testament to human ingenuity and the capacity for organized production, yet simultaneously a monument to coercion, suffering, and the subordination of human dignity to the imperatives of labor and authority. And the philosophical reflection derived from the Pitt reveals that civilization's rebirth in a post-apocalyptic context is inseparable from these dualities, wherein progress, efficiency, and survival coexist with exploitation, moral compromise, and social stratification, and the blurred line between tyrant and savior is made manifest in the contrasting legacies of Ashur and Vernher, whose respective approaches to governance, ethical decision-making, and engagement with the enslaved population illuminate the spectrum of human leadership under extreme circumstances, demonstrating that the designation of hero, villain, or pragmatic administrator is contingent upon perspective, values, and the consequences of action, and the post-nuclear human condition, as epitomized by the Pitt, can thus be understood as a negotiation between the imperatives of survival, the ethical demands of freedom, and the practical realities of rebuilding society from devastation, where the enduring legacy of the city is not merely the physical landscape or the immediate outcomes of rebellion, but the cumulative lessons regarding the responsibilities, risks, and moral imperatives faced by those who seek to govern, liberate, or rebuild, and these lessons resonate across the wasteland in the behavior of subsequent settlements, the strategies of factions such as the Brotherhood of Steel, and the cultural memory of populations who learned to navigate authority, coercion, and opportunity in extreme environments. And the study of the Pitt's legacy provides insight into the interplay of human resilience, ethical deliberation, and structural adaptation, emphasizing that the reconstruction of civilization in post-nuclear America is an endeavor that requires balancing material necessity with moral principle, authority with freedom, and coercion with justice. And in reflecting upon the Pitt, one observes that cruelty, when entwined with human ingenuity and survival necessity, can create functional, resilient systems, yet it is ethical choice, courage, and the assertion of autonomy that ultimately determine the long-term viability, legitimacy, and humanistic character of a society. And the city's story, from the ashes of pre-war Pittsburgh to the industrialized tyranny of Ashur, the uprising of the enslaved, and the divergent outcomes determined by the lone wanderer and Vernher, illustrates that post-apocalyptic civilization is always a product of both material circumstances and the ethical, strategic, and courageous choices of human actors, leaving a legacy that is at once cautionary, instructive, and enduring, a testament to the capacity of human beings to endure, innovate, and assert moral agency even in the face of unparalleled adversity. And thus, the final reflection upon the Pitt is that its legacy is not merely historical, but philosophical. It challenges observers to consider the cost of survival, the price of industrialized order, the ethical weight of leadership, and the enduring question of what it means to rebuild civilization when the foundations of human society have been irrevocably shattered, leaving a city forged from steel, smoke, and human endurance as both a monument and a mirror, reflecting the resilience, cruelty, ingenuity, and moral complexity of post-nuclear humanity in a world forever transformed by fire and choice.